Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining our session on compliance, regulatory, and tax issues for civil society organizations in Uganda. I would like to take you through a few housekeeping matters, which I hope will enhance the webinar experience for all of you. As participants, you will notice that you're automatically muted and the chat function has been disabled. So should you have any questions during the webinar, please make sure to use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will be submitted to the facilitator and we will discuss through as a panel during an appropriate time during the webinar. The session will be facilitated by the Executive Director of Akina Mama Wa Africa, Eunice Musiime. Welcome, Eunice, and thank you for preceding the session for us.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Luthando. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panelists and welcome to all participants that have joined in. I recognize my civil society colleagues who have joined us this morning. I'm heartwarmed that we've put aside time to be part of this webinar, which is happening on a Monday. I know Monday is not an easy day for people to put aside for a webinar, but the fact that I see a number of my civil society colleagues is a testament that this is a timely and important conversation. We have together a panel of eminent lawyers and tax advisors that we believe will help us interrogate some of the legal and compliance issues that continue to bedevil the civil society landscape. 2020 has not been an easier for globally, but civil society globally too has gone through a number of challenges. And we do hope that this webinar will be one of those that will contribute to increased knowledge, increased understanding, increased appreciation of how we can build back better during COVID and post-COVID as the civil society sector. This is an important conversation and we look forward to an enriching conversation. This morning, ladies and gentlemen, we have a panel of three, David Mpanga, who is going to present on legal and regulatory compliance in Uganda. David, you're welcome. And we also have Ronald Kalema, who is going to present on tax compliance. Ronald, you're welcome. And we have Nicholas Opiyo, our very own, who is going to give us a more nuanced perspective of the legal and regulatory framework, but also adding the dynamic of where we are as the civil society in Uganda. So my panel, you're very welcome. To catch up with time, I'll request David to unmute and start with his presentation.
Thank you very much, Eunice. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. And let me also start by apologizing to everybody for the time that we lost in the technical issues at the beginning of this webinar. Here at Bowmans, we like to think of ourselves as corporate lawyers who advise corporate entities, mostly commercial corporate entities, on matters that concern them and keep their board or their CEOs awake. And so when we talk to CSOs, we would like to talk about regulatory, legal, and tax compliance for CSOs from the basis of the things that should be keeping your executive directors, your boards awake at night, those crises that come and need solutions that may not be off the shelf. The major points that we need to put across first and foremost, by way of introduction, are that CSOs work within an existing legal and political framework or ecosystem. CSOs, as we know them, civil society organizations, as we know them, are lineal successors or are directly descended from Victorian charities that set up in the late 18th, early 19th century in the United Kingdom Generally, charities that were looking out for the lesser advantaged people in society, and which morphed from just giving handouts or generally doing charitable work like soup kitchens or dormitories for homeless people, hostels for homeless people, into advocacy around the issues that they were seeing. So they stopped just giving out, say, bread or soup and started asking, why are people hungry? And started talking about workers' rights and started talking about exploitation of the working poor, etc. Those values then morphed into what we now know as non-governmental organizations, which look into alleviating people's welfare, but also looking at the issues or advocating for improvement of the issues which cause those problems that they try to alleviate in society. Civil society organizations also in this part of the world are lineal successors of missionary organizations, organizations that came to propagate a new religion, Christianity, but often also then engaged in education, engaged in other social welfare activities, education, health, and the like. It's therefore tempting often to look at civil society organizations as some kind of being a world apart. They're different kinds of fish. And if you look at that image in front of you, you see some fish, but you see a turtle also swimming. And it's easy to think of the turtle as being different from the fish. Civil society organizations are not for profit. They are different from political organizations. They're not seeking power. Actively seeking power. So it's often thought that they're different and therefore viewed and operated in a different way. But in fact, they live in the same legal, same political framework, same ecosystem. So we need to think of regulatory compliance in that sense. And it's often also as a result of the civil society organizations being engaged in advocacy. There is often a tendency to think of the law as it ought to be, to think of all the things that you don't like in the law or you think are oppressive and wrong, and seek to only comply with the law as you think it ought to be. But from a legal practitioner's point of view, we would be urging you to look at compliance and understand it on the basis of the law as it is, understand that civil society organizations are as much occupants of this legal space and political space as any other actors, commercial, corporate entities, natural individuals or natural citizens, and understand that we all have to comply. We all have to know where the lines are. And even if from a point of view of advocacy or of civil engagement, civic engagement, we wish to see laws changed, we must first understand the legal framework within which we are operating. And the legal framework from which we operate as civil society organizations starts right from the NGO Act 2016, the Companies Act 2012, that is one if you're registering as an NGO or if you're registering as a company limited by guarantee. Those give you legal personality. And then you get into, once you've got legal personality, you can sue and be sued, you get into a whole host of things that you need to understand, all regulated by law. For the people that you take on as employees, you've got the Employees Act, the Employment Act, sorry. You've got, if they're from outside Uganda, to think about Immigration Act issues. You need to think about the NSSF Act. You need to think about the Income Tax Act. You need to think about the VAT Act. And my colleague and my partner and colleague, Ronald, will be dealing delving deeper into those three. You need to think about the Anti-Money Laundering Act. You need to think about Political Organizations Act, Political Parties and Organizations Act, and a whole host of others. All of these meaning that we are, being creatures of law, being occupants of this legal ecosystem, there is a need to always have an eye on compliance. And to that extent, many times civil society organizations have very good compliance with the rules and regulations of donor organizations, if the donor organizations are offshore. You're very mindful of the things that you need to do in order to qualify for funding by bilateral aid organizations or by private non-NGOs outside Uganda. And those checklists are very carefully looked at and meticulously observed, because if you don't do that, the donor funder may lose their own donor status or NGO status, or you may be struck off a particular list of eligibility. Well, in the same way as we need to look at the compliance with the donors' rules and regulations, we must always be conscious of the rules and regulations, the laws that govern the space within which we operate. Is our license based on I'm talking about the NGO license here, based on the application and the representations we made at the time when we were seeking to become registered? If it is, the money that we're taking on, is that money and the work that we want to do, does it fall within our license? Are there any conditionalities on our license that we must always keep an eye on? Are there any rules and regulations that need to be considered, or legal risks that need to be considered in our day-to-day operations? These things then make you understand, once you have an eye on them, the need for larger organizations to have a dedicated compliance officer. The need for the larger organizations, actually for each organization, to have an anti-money laundering officer. That's a requirement of the Anti-Money Laundering Act. And that person might be the same person as the compliance officer. The need to have on perhaps a retainer or a regular arrangement, external legal advice, so that as you move, you're constantly aware of where the lines are and what the risks are, and how you're weighing them up from time to time is very, very critical. There is also a need to understand that our ecosystem may be polluted, if I may extend the analogy a little, by politicization, by militarization, by situations that may be less than desirable. We don't live in a utopia. I think that no civil society organization anywhere in the world will tell you that they operate in an ideal situation that they would like to operate in. But there's often a tendency to try and confuse this for persecution or for obstruction or for generally non-cooperation from government, where our rules, our laws, our legal system may not be as developed as that in other situations. I'm sure all of you, or many of you, will have come across the fact that the adjudication committee that's provided for in the NGO Act 2016 hasn't been operational. And that has probably meant that all forms of disputes have to be sent to the High Court, which is clogged up with regular disputes from all sorts of angles. And therefore, the fast and quick adjudication of disputes that was envisioned in the Act has not been a reality. We're told now that the adjudication committee has been empaneled. I don't know whether it has started hearing matters, disputes, and if it started hearing disputes, whether it's hearing them efficiently and effectively. But you get situations where our ecosystem is lacking, but there are also situations where our ecosystem is polluted, where it's overly policed. People are viewed with suspicion. Innocent motives are morphed into sinister motives. CSOs are frequently accused of harboring political agendas. If they're talking about civic space, they're frequently accused of being Trojan horses for foreign powers or for foreign interests to interfere with our political system. In all those situations, we think that it is important, very, very critical, that you choose formality over informality. Why? Because even in our limited space, our underdeveloped space, call it what you like, formality is much better than living in an informal space. And what do I mean by formality? Always make sure that you're on the right side of the law. and that you're keeping records in accordance with the law, and that you are taking weighted risks within an understanding of your legal risk matrix, and that you're recording your decision making as you move, that you're working in accordance with proper corporate governance parameters, so that your management
us on a route of compliance and emphasizing that we need to comply. And as he presented, I couldn't help but think about the fact that the famous quote that if a law is unjust, a man is not only right to disobey it, he's obligated to do so. And so I hope we can have discussions beyond compliance. What is it that we would like to see? Oh, David is back. Welcome back, David. I was simply holding fort. Please continue with your presentation.
I was saying that we need to live in the world as it is rather than as it ought to be. And unfortunately, one of the way in which the world is we have unstable connections. Let me just go back to where I was. Forgive me. There we go. I hope everybody can see my slides. So yes, I was explaining that we need to live in the world, in the ecosystem as it is, rather than as it ought to be, and understand the risks that we take. And have internal advice on this, but also external advice is always necessary, especially as you become larger as a CSO. And I was also then saying that we need to choose formality over informality. And the formality starts right from how we register, how we incorporate ourselves, how we manage ourselves in terms of corporate governance, how we manage ourselves in terms of finance, how we manage ourselves in terms of operations. All of these things must be formally done. They need to be formally done because even as the donor entities or the donor funders often require information to be formally kept in order that they can review and check so that they may comply with their own parent regulatory environment. It's essential that CSOs, local CSOs, understand that informality is the biggest and easiest way for any, let me call them malactors, to come against you. And what do I mean? If I wanted to shut down a particular CSO and I was looking for a means to do so, the easiest things would be to see whether you've formally registered, if you're complying with your license, if you're paying tax, if you're doing things in accordance with laws. So your executive director or your CFO or whoever is a non-Ugandan, they're working on a work permit in Uganda or they're on a special pass. You know this to be the case. You've stepped on some toes because of what you're doing. Suddenly, your immigration status, the immigration status of the ED is brought up. If you haven't obtained the necessary work permit, if you're operating on a special pass that is expired, expect that informality is going to be the easiest route for somebody to pull your shirt, if I may now go into footballing analogies, and stop you from scoring the goal that you wanted to score. If you have tax issues, expect that your audits are going to be more brutal and expect that they will eventually interfere with your operations. If your board is not in control or doesn't understand the operations and is not generally abreast with the issues that it must be abreast with, understand that you might be taking on more risk than you should be taking, and you will not be getting the benefit of that board. This informality is often the enemy within, because you're creating a fourth column. You're creating an opportunity for somebody to stop you and stop you legitimately or with the guise of legitimacy. If you haven't managed to do things properly, you then tend to find yourself unable to go to court or to seek for the remedies that you need to seek for properly, because you start from the back foot. There are issues around your funding. You've not been given proper accountability on your funding. You're not able to account properly for the money that's been sent to you. Suddenly, the accounts are frozen. If you went to court about this, you might find that there is examination of what the money that came into your account has been used for. Suddenly, you're concerned and you're looking for ways, if I may put it in inverted commas, informal ways to resolve the freeze on your accounts. That going into the corridors rather than taking things into the light will draw you further into informality and compromise your organization, because then you have to make certain compromises, certain bargains. I won't say with the devil, but you're forced to make compromises that might make you less able to pursue your agenda properly. If you'd started properly and formally, if that deviation from the norm had not begun, you would have found it easier to stand your ground and say, this is an improper action, it's an infringement on our rights, and we want to stand by what we're doing as right, and we want to take this to court and deal with it openly. So formality, again, requires a lot of input from external advisors, legal advisors, tax advisors, and the like. So one other thing that I'd like to point out very clearly, very emphatically, is the need for formality over informality. We're frequently afflicted by the way in which we begin, influencing the way in which we continue. So be mindful of the fact that your beginning, even if your beginning has been less formal, if your board is not sitting as frequently as it should, if your records are not kept easily retrievable in an easily retrievable way, all those things, that informality may come back to bite you at a later stage, and is frequently the cause of the demise of CSOs. Lastly, as I wrap up, think about things around internal controls. I've talked about boards, but you also need to think about within the corporate governance space, audits, external audits and internal audits. You must have an audit function as well, making sure that funding is properly accounted for. This is we have found frequent area of weakness for CSOs, the inability to control things internally and to account for things properly. This, whether it be for funding, but also for things like NSSF, pay as you earn, and the like, as my colleague Ronald will speak to in a minute. The other area that you need to consider very closely is political advocacy and political funding. Political advocacy is a right that is founded in our constitution. You are entitled, perfectly entitled within our constitution and within internationally recognized democratic norms to advocate on areas that are political with a small p. But I think the key is, with civil society organization, you're not doing it in a partisan way. You're doing it because you think the right to housing, access to water, gender equality, and the like. All these are very important things that have a political, with a small p, aspect. But always be mindful of the fact that there are lines which can inadvertently be crossed. There are things that cause those in authority to be cross, but which are perfectly legal and legitimate. But there are also things that you might be doing inadvertently and violating your legal obligations. The same applies to political funding. be very careful about how funding may be applied in the political space, and how it may be confused. Now, again, the Anti-Money Laundering Act here is frequently used to stop CSOs accessing money. It is not a crime because the Anti-Money Laundering Act deals with laundering of money, the proceeds of crime. It is not a crime to receive money from abroad. It's not a crime to apply money to causes such as equality, such as housing, such as social welfare. But funding must be channeled properly. It must be accounted or accountable in a manner that complies with the law. And again, a lot of legal advice is required, and practical financial and tax advisory is required around how funding may be properly applied. I'm not saying that once that's done, you will not be subject to attack. No, what I'm saying is, in the moment of crisis, the last thing you want to be doing is fixing things and understanding where you should have been, rather than dealing with the crisis knowing I'm exactly within my rights, I know exactly where I should be. It's also important to understand what happens in the situation of distress, is what I've called remedies for distress. What happens when a deportation order is suddenly served? What remedies do we have when bank accounts are frozen, be it by the central bank or the Financial Intelligence Authority, or the bank acting on instructions of other entities? We need to understand, again, remedies that we have in situations where decisions have been made by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, for example, relating to immigration, the NGO board, sudden deregistration, the company's registry, the FIA, and others. There are frequently legal remedies. There are often opportunities to address these situations without full recourse to judicial review or suits by plaintiff, which might take years to resolve. But there also might be a need for certain of these matters to be taken, for example, for constitutional petitions or others, to get the right cases to determine the rights or wrongs of situations in a way that sets precedents. Many organizations find themselves in a situation where they have to choose between full compliance and getting a determination of the law in situations like this, or having to lay off people, having to close down. I'm not for a minute underestimating that situation, but I'm saying, if I may hark back to my beginning, that if decisions have been made formally, if internal controls exist, if legal risk is properly managed and understood, it's frequently easier, one, to stand one's ground, and two, to get a proper adjudication of these situations. It's also frequently easier to prevent the kind of intervention that might cause this kind of situation of distress. But we set aside time to hear from you in our question session, so we'll be happy to answer questions as they arise. So generally, my end point would be there is a need for civil society organizations to understand themselves as operators in an ecosystem in which you require advice and knowledge on compliance, in which you should be choosing formality over informality, and in which you need to be constantly looking at situations that might be inroads for adverse interference with your objectives. To keep in mind that when those situations arise, there are remedies, and to be sure that when those remedies are sought, one comes with the cleanest hands possible. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm sorry about the technical glitch that occurred. Eunice?
Thank you, David, for that exposition. I see that there are already some questions for you in the chat room, so you'll be able to look at those and respond to during the question and answer session. Thank you for highlighting the fact that we need to operate in an ecosystem. I would also like to move the needle a little further and say that as CSOs or as NGOs, as advocates, that can be a bit problematic. By the nature of who we are, activists, we also like to color outside the lines. And so there's need for interrogation on how that can happen. But then also to say, we welcome the fact that we need to work with formality and not informality, but then it's also not as clear-cut as it should be. There are gray areas, there are lots of gray areas in our law, and that also presents some challenges. I wish the binaries were as clear, formality and informality. There are lots of gray areas, even when we look at the Public Order Management Act, which requires that when we are going to hold a public meeting, we inform the police, but then that has been interpreted differently in the current environment. So there are also all those that we need to look at. And finally, as you presented while you are off, I said that I recalled the quote that if a law is unjust, a man is not only right to disobey it, he's also obligated to do so. And I know that a number of civil society activists actually are of that view and would like to know how you reconcile that with formality. But those are my thoughts. Thank you, David, for that exposition this morning. I'll quickly move on to Ronald Kalema to present to us the nitty-gritties of tax compliance, an issue that remains a holy grail in civil society space. So over to you, Ronald. We look forward to your presentation. Ronald?
Thank you, Eunice and David. Thank you, Eunice and David. I hope you can hear me properly now.
Yes, now we can hear you.
Just a minute. If you can see my screen. Yeah, I'm briefly going to talk about the tax aspects, just to, as a follow-up on what David said. Tax is a key compliance measure for CSOs, and it's a key worry because, as you all know, tax means money. The government wants a piece of the money. You also need money to carry out your agenda and your programs here in Uganda. So it is not something that you leave to the accounting function or to external auditors, but it is something that you ought to be aware of as an organization. It should be a key part of your strategy. Briefly, what we are going to look at is what is happening now in terms of URA's focus on not-for-profit organizations. Then you will note that the compliance issues for tax for CSOs cut across all tax heads. Due to time constraints, we'll just pick out a few issues that are common that we have seen in practice, where URA is focusing in terms of income tax, withholding tax, VAT, and then of course the payroll. And then we'll briefly discuss what to do when you're in distress. As you are aware, currently, this is 2020. Everybody's looking for money, and so is the government. Elections are coming up. Elections are financed by revenue. And one of the places where the government is looking to collect this money is from you. Make no mistake about it. And because you are not business entities per se, government has, the URA considers CSOs as high risk in terms of compliance. More often than not, you find the proper taxes are not paid. Some CSOs are not even registered for taxes. The return filing levels are not very good. So there is a focus in terms of revenue leakage that goes through the NGO sector. So clearly in the last year, we have seen that there's a lot of focus, the increased audit of NGOs and CSOs. And we have seen huge assessments, unbelievable assessments that can go back 5, 10 years if they suspect fraud. That is why compliance is very important for you. You should take it seriously. And to emphasize David's point, you should favor formality over informality, even with URA, because in the long run, it is cheaper to comply than to cut corners. You may well have heard about the voluntary disclosure program and the laws that have passed this year, primarily to give relief amidst the COVID pandemic. These reliefs are also available to you. For example, just last month, the government essentially waived all penalties and interest for all taxpayers, as long as the penalties and interest were due by 30th June. I think that is one of the biggest developments in terms of compliance and allowing people to come up and self-declare in the past 10 years. The last waiver was passed in 2008. That is 12 years ago. So it is something that is welcome, and I think will increase URA's tax base in terms of encouraging more people to come up and be tax compliant. Where non-compliance is identified correctly or otherwise, you all know that URA is ruthless. Enforcement measures are aggressive. You can be closed. Some people have been refused to travel pending formalization of their tax bills. Others have been deported. Bank accounts have been frozen in terms of getting agency notices enforced by the banks. So a serious issue of non-compliance can prove existential. It is one of the things they can use to severely disrupt your agenda as an organization. So amidst that background, what are some of the few areas we see that you need to pay attention to in terms of compliance? And I will start with income tax. Since most CSOs and NGOs are not for profit, there is no serious focus to comply with corporate income tax. And this is more often than not a mistake. Because as long as you are a registered person, you must be registered for income tax and file returns, even if you do not have income tax, even if you don't have chargeable income, that is, you are not in business. Most people assume that if your organization is charitable, income tax exemption is automatic. That is not the case. You must do a formal application to the URA, which must be evaluated and approved. And this is one of the tools that URA uses to force compliance elsewhere in terms of pay as you earn, in terms of withholding tax, to check whether an applicant is worthy. So in terms of the tax law that as we have it now, the persons who qualify for exemptions are religious, charitable, and amateur sporting associations. That one, whose income do not benefit any other person individually. 2, they are of a public character. And 3, they have applied to the commissioner and have been granted that status of being exempt. it is not automatic, as I mentioned. You may have heard of the case of International School of Uganda that reached the High Court just recently. I think for the past 15 years, the URA had been granting them an exemption as a matter of routine. Sometime in 2015, all of a sudden, the answer came back negative, that you are not exempt, you should pay taxes. And they considered themselves exempt because they consider themselves an education institution of a public character. And they thought that the URA's refusal to grant that confirmation does not take away that status. And certainly, they do not need to go back to the URA every year to confirm that status of exemption. They lost in the Tax Appeals Tribunal, they lost in the High Court, and the judges have affirmed that the commissioner has powers to evaluate your application, whether you qualify for this exemption or not, and they may be at liberty to deny it or even revoke it if they find that, for example, you have not complied with the objectives of your organization or you are non-compliant in other areas. So what is happening now is that the URA also looks at how you're complying with other laws, essentially the NGO Act. Are you properly registered? Do you have a permit? Are you filing returns for your directors? Do they have work permits that are valid? So if you do not have these other things in place, you don't get an income tax exemption. So we have seen instances where the organization has, of course, it has no profit and loss statement. What it has is an income and expenditure statement. But the URA has gone ahead to assess income tax on the surplus. And the argument they put forward is you cannot claim to be an NGO when you don't have a valid certificate from the Bureau, or you don't have a permit, or your permit has expired. So that's to remove all these avenues through which the URA can come at you. The easy way is for you to comply. Yes, you are an NGO. Yes, you are not in business. Yes, perhaps you have a little income generating activities which you use to sow back the proceeds into the charitable organizations. But the rule of thumb is comply, because if you do not at least do the formal filings and all, you open yourself up to attack. The other key point to note is that even if you are exempt, you must file returns. And this is very important because URA uses the information that you have given them to assess how well you're complying elsewhere. For example, they may ask for your sources of income. And when they see the funding agreements you have and they are not matching what you have filed in your income tax return as grant income, questions start coming up. And I dealt with a case recently where that variance between the funding agreement and the income tax return was assessed to tax because the taxpayer could not explain where the balance of the money went. And that could be the beginning of the start of problems in terms of the NGO Bureau also coming in terms of the FIA, as David mentioned, also starting to question what you're doing with your money. So it is very important that you take filing seriously, because this information is used within the URA to do that analysis and actually confirm that what you are doing, what you say you are doing is actually what you're doing, and that's what your documents are saying. The other key thing is that not all income is exempt. For example, if you are a CSO and you have income generating activities, some of you write best-selling books, you sell them and earn income. I've seen others that own taxis and buses on the road. They generate income from that. Others have poultry farms, very huge poultry farms in Kalangala or elsewhere. You must know, you need to know and evaluate the tax treatment of that income that you get that is not essentially donor funded, or you do not generate from donations, and accord it the correct tax treatment. If you do not, the risk with tax is that the URA can approach you right now in 2020 and ask for tax on income that you earned in 2015. You can imagine that kind of scenario. When you have moved on 5 budgets later, you don't even remember what you used the money for. So it's very important that you keep actively evaluating what you're doing and think about it with a tax mind, because it can potentially be very risky for you. In terms of withholding tax, this is an extremely high area because CSOs are expense centers. You spend money. You spend money on purchase of goods. You purchase goods on activities. You pay consultants. Sometimes you pay us lawyers, although not a lot. I'm surprised David did not complain about this. You should pay more money to lawyers, accountants, consultants. You spend money on community projects. Essentially, you are spenders. That is why in 2018 in July, if you will notice, the URA released a list of designated withholding tax agents, a new one. And when you look through that list, there are a lot of additions that were made from the CSO community. Surprisingly, I found in this year 2020 that people are being assessed withholding tax, but they did not know that they are actually designation. Designation means that the URA compulsorily forces you to become an agent so that whomever you pay an amount exceeding 1 million shillings, you withhold 6%. And for payments to non-residents, you withhold 15%. So you need to check and see, one, are you designated or not? And if you are, you must factor that into your budget and comply accordingly. Whether you are designated or not, for professional fees, if you're paying auditors, lawyers, and any other professionals, you must withhold 6%, whether you're registered for withholding tax or not. So we find that in the excitement of spending this money, the CSOs forget the obligation, and the URA ends up collecting this money from them, severely affecting your budgeting and, of course, disrupting your activities. So this is a high-risk area. It is an area of huge focus, and you must not leave it lagging behind. There has been, of recent, an effort to collect tax from purchase of assets. If you have recently paid stamp duty to change registration of a land title, you might know what I'm talking about. A few weeks after that, you will get a demand from the URA requiring that you, the purchaser, you ought to have withheld 6% when you're paying for the asset you purchased. And that law is effective 1st January, effective 1st July 2019, and it's in force. And you must look out for it as well in terms of when you're purchasing major assets, either for use in your activities or for capital expansion. So on the whole, I would say that withholding tax is the biggest risk NGOs face. One, because you are cost centers, and two, a lot of of the CSOs were designated agents, which means that regardless of what you're paying for, as long as it's a good or a service, you have to withhold 6% and pay it over to URA, failure of which you are the one who takes the responsibility for it. So it's something to look out for. In terms of VAT, some of us might well think that since NGOs are not in business, they don't make supplies, VAT issues rarely come up. But for some who make international payments, there's VAT compliance requirements. Of course, things like management fees, foreign consultants that you might bring in for certain projects, if you're paying royalties of any kind, or you are paying for software to anyone who is not a Ugandan, there's a VAT obligation for you to account. And this is on you who is importing the service, who is paying for the service. This is irrespective of whether you are registered or not. This is very important to note. Even if you are in business, even if you are a private person like me, as long as you have imported a service, the VAT Act puts an obligation on you to account for that VAT. And we most often find that CSOs are caught unaware of this obligation, and the penalties for non-compliance with VAT are quite high and punitive. So it is definitely something to think about whenever you are using the services of either head office, or you're paying management fees, or you have a foreign consultant that you're going to employ in this in this season. For example, I will just say something that has come to my mind. If you have poll watchers, people who are coming to watch elections next year, and you are paying them, but they are foreign. Election watching is not an exempt service, so you have to account for VAT if you are making that payment and you're going to report it to URA. Most people also ask me whether, since you are an NGO, when you are importing certain goods, you ought not to pay taxes at importation. It's important to note that there is no specific exemption for you as an NGO, merely by virtue of that status, just because you are importing goods. So for imports, you must check what exactly you are importing, what it is for, and generally, more often than not, NGOs pay import duties, as you know. There are very few exemptions outside the one set by the East African Customs Law. I will move on to payroll and lastly, point out some of the key risk areas. This is a significant part of your budget, so it attracts a lot of interest from both URA and the NSSF. And some of the things they often look out for are those payments you make outside the payroll. Consultancy fees, per diem. You will find that some people earn per diem that is 25 times higher than their monthly salary. And then the question will be that this kind of per diem, what is it? And should it pay taxes or not? So facilitation allowance, people who go out in the field to carry out the activities of the organization, how much do you pay them and how do you treat that payment? What is the payment expected to do? People who pay airtime allowance of 2 million every day, for example. Can you justify making calls worth 2 million a day? And will you be able to, have you accounted, given that payment, the right tax treatment? So you need to seriously look at the payments you make to your staff primarily outside of the payroll and evaluate and actually confirm that you do not have a tax exposure. As I mentioned earlier, 3 years from now, when the staff has even left, the contract has ended, you'll be the one on the hook for that money. Consultants who are employed by more than one employer. This is a common occurrence with NGOs. What do you do as an employer when you know your employee is working elsewhere and getting a salary? Who should be the primary employer and who should be the secondary employer? Because there is a risk that if a person is earning 2 salaries at the same time, they end up paying less tax. So it is something to look out for within your payroll and make sure that you disclose to the URA these people to avoid the exposure in terms of pay-as-you-earn areas. Then we have short-term consultants, people who come onto projects for a short while. We've seen instances where some organizations designate them as independent consultants and withhold 6%. But the contracts they have, the way they are paid, some of them are paid on the same day the payroll is processed. They have an office, they stay for a period of over 1 year, but they are not paying pay-as-you-earn. So you need to evaluate whether you're giving your consultants the correct treatment, because we have seen many cases, and so many cases have reached the tribunal where the dispute is, no thanks, but these are not consultants, they're actually your employees. So you must account for 30% pay-as-you-earn instead of 6% withholding tax. Then, of course, the benefits in kind, housing. If you give staff housing, you have employees who get motor vehicles, or you pay for your employees' rent. Do you include this in the payroll, and do you accord them the correct formulas? That is always something the URA looks out for when they come to visit you during audits. And then, of course, expatriate staff. The most common risk area I see here is that organizations get expatriates to come in, they give them a work permit, but they don't pay them. For example, you have an ED who sits here in Uganda. He is here for more than 1 year, but the ED is not on the payroll. When the URA comes, they are the first person they talk to, but when they check the payroll, the name is not there. And that is normally high risk because we know that once a person is exercising employment in Uganda, regardless of where they are paid, they are liable to Ugandan tax as residents. So what kind of planning have you done to ensure that, yes, your expatriate staff pay the right taxes? Are they filing individual returns? Are they paying taxes in their home countries? If not, what can you do? There's a lot of tax planning that can go into that kind of arrangement so that you avoid exposure for the organization in terms of accounting for tax for these often very useful staff. So what can you do? We know that audits have increased. We know that CSOs are a specific target. Yes, they are cost centers. What can be done? Our advice here at Bowmans is that be proactive. Don't wait for the URA to come to your door. Do a self-review. We call it a health check. And of course, you will need professional advice with this, but the key point is be proactive, check whether you have exposure or not, address historical problems, and comply going forward. We have some friendly amendments that have come in this year. Take advantage of them. If you know you have an issue that has been nagging the organization in terms of tax, address it. You can ask for waivers, you can ask for payment plans, you can approach the URA for remittance of tax. All those options are available to you. The mistake most people make is to sit on it, and hopefully the URA never finds out. These days, they have so many ways of finding out. For example, they can find out from the people you deal with, the consultants who supply you services, from the returns you have filed, from publicity. Some people get huge donations and then they appear in newspapers as having got this big budget to finance certain activities. But when the URA checks the returns, there is nothing. You become a red flag, a target. It is also important to know what your obligations are so that you take actions from a point of knowledge. Very often, those who know navigate some of these issues much more better than those who do not know. And you need to act quickly because for tax matters, time is of the essence. If you have an assessment, the law gives you 45 days to object. If you do not object, even if the tax is incorrect, some officer just dreamt it up, it is due and payable. You have nothing to do about it. So observe the time, know what to do, you consult, because without a doubt, we know that sometimes the URA comes up with assessments that are not correct, and they can use this against you, push you in a corner, force you into compromising positions if you do not know what is happening. But lastly, the song is comply. Choose formality over informality, because in the long run, it is cheaper. But at the same time, do not feel shy about fighting incorrect assessments, because we have seen as practitioners, we very often see that the tribunal, the tax appeals tribunal, is capable of reversing URA decisions that turn out to be incorrect. But the primary duty for you as a taxpayer, as a citizen, a responsible citizen, is to comply, as the URA person would say, as we develop Uganda together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ronald, for that presentation. I felt like I was in a tax compliance training, and I guess that's what is needed for CSOs as one of the solutions going forward. We actually need more deep dives into tax compliance, especially for our finance team. When I joined Akina Mama Wa Africa, one of the things I did was to apply for tax exemption. That was 4 years ago. And I found that they had to go back in our records, and we had lots of tax issues and we had to pay back a lot of money. So I speak from a personal lived reality of having found outside the lines of tax compliance. I see a lot of questions for you, Ronald, in the question and answer in terms of tax issues. Our third panelist, unfortunately, Nicholas Opiyo, has had to leave. I know that a lot of CSOs had wanted to hear a bit more about steps one can take when their accounts are closed. What's this wave of accounts closing? So I do believe that David will be able to handle some of those questions. It was on his last slide. So maybe explaining a little bit more, especially now that the stories have been in the monitor about the closure of accounts. And while it's not public, the specific cases are not public, but CSOs would want to know what steps do you take once your account has been closed, once you've been notified your bank, that your account is closed, and so what step do you take? Ronald, it was quite interesting to know that NGOs are considered high-risk entities in terms of tax compliance, and thinking about how a lot of our informal sector are also not tax compliant. I was a bit shocked by that remark, but I guess it's a debatable aspect. For most NGOs, we also know that tax is a huge issue. Uganda's tax to GDP ratio has not been as great as our neighbors, Kenya or Tanzania. And so we know that URA is making all efforts to ensure that they increase the tax to GDP ratio. So that's an issue we appreciate and know that we also need to be compliant. And we also know that there are some companies that seem to be more favored than CSOs who get all the waivers. And CSOs right now have been having huge campaigns on illicit financial flows and saying that tax waivers also create an environment to as well illicit flows to leave the country. And NGOs are not part of that. So, but maybe that's a conversation for another day. I will revert back to David to answer the questions that were specifically posed for David. David, I don't know whether you saw the questions or you'd want me to summarize them from the question and answer.
I think, Eunice, for speed and ease, let me just very quickly say that Nicholas had been asked to join us specifically to give us what would be the lived view of a CSO. Nicholas would not mind me calling him an amphibian in his absence. He's a lawyer who works in the civil society space. So he's quite comfortable on land and water. I leave you to determine which is land, CSO space or legal practice. But unfortunately, the lived experience of legal practice is that sometimes you're called before judges at very short notice. So Nicholas had to leave us before he could share with colleagues in the civil society space practical lived experiences of situations such as frozen accounts. If I may address that, because it's a frequently asked question. Whatever situation is done by, whatever action is taken by an executive entity, such as the Financial Intelligence Authority, the Bank of Uganda, the Uganda Police, CID, the Department of the Uganda Police, is subject to two things: one, administrative review, and two, judicial review. So if there is in the provision of the particular entity that is acting provision for administrative review, that is a lower officer has taken a decision, and you can take it up with a superior officer or with that officer themselves, it's generally recommended that you first try administrative steps, notifying or appealing to that particular entity and saying that this action is wrong because in saying this action is wrong because you need to think of about 3 or 4 things. One, illegality. You have no power. You, the person who has frozen my account, have no legal power or legal basis to freeze my account. In legal jargon, we call that ultra vires. If an act is ultra vires, it means the executive agency or officer who's taken that step doesn't have the legal power, or that power is not vested in that particular person. So if the FIA have power to freeze accounts, it doesn't mean that any entity just walking out of government can come along and say, I've frozen an account. It means that you're able then to say you're acting illegally. It's not vested in you as an agency, or it's not vested in, it must be signed by this person again. 2, and they're not mutually exclusive, you always have a right to procedural propriety. Procedural propriety includes the right to natural justice. You cannot be condemned, you should not be condemned and heard. You're entitled to be heard, to make representations around why, if the action is legal, it's an action that should not be visited upon you. Lastly, there must be no bias. So if there's, for example, been an illustration by a particular officer or by a particular agency of an interest in the matter in which you're dealing, and therefore some element of unfairness caused by bias, you can raise that or should raise that. You should also be able to raise other issues like proportionality and rationality. Is the action rational? Have they taken into account all material factors and disregarded all irrelevant factors? Or is it simply guided by irrelevant factors? Administrative review is similar to, but very different purely by virtue of formality, from walking in, making a call and lobbying, what we usually call lobbying. That kind of situation generally leads you into the dark corridors, talking about the lobbying, where you might be squeezed even more. You might be asked to begin to bargain your rights for certain things that you may not find very palatable. So generally, one would recommend that there should be a formal administrative review, a request for an administrative review, which, if declined or not properly attended to, gives one the right to go for what's called judicial review. And judicial review is courts of Uganda exercising overriding or supervisory rights over executive action. Now, sometimes these things are not quick, but again, the grounds, as I said, are legality, rationality, procedural propriety. It's often better, and this leads me to a question that Sisa Kagaba asked, it's often better to be in the courts, slow as they may be, and perhaps with the perception of capture, than to be in that no man's land where one might end up having to make bargains around shifting goals. So you'll be told, all right, we'll free your account up, we understand you, but we would like you to ensure that you pipe down, stop talking as loud as you have to. Stay away from these particular activists or these particular actions. Those things might be actually beyond the legal realm and purely in the political. Of course, you'll be the judges of those which you are aware and those which you can't. But in my view, any form of informality generally leads you into further informality, and it's more dangerous than not. Turning to the questions, I tried to answer many of the questions that were raised to save time in the chat. But Eric Abima asked about budgeting for compliance with annual accounts. And I said to Eric that annual accounting, as my colleague Ronald will further expound, is not only a legal requirement, but it's also good for organizations. It is good for you to know accurately where you stand financially. So if you've not been budgeting for the services of an auditor or an accountant, you've not been budgeting for AGM and board meetings to manage other aspects of your business, of your operation, but also to manage and understand your affairs, you need to do so. You've not been budgeting properly. This is not only exacerbating your legal risk, it's also generally creating a situation where your operation, you're now getting into operational risk. So it's important that you budget for that. There were questions around when is funding characterized, this was via letter Linda, when is funding characterized as political funding? Well, any organization will be governed by its constitution, its license, and of course the law, the general law. But all organizations, just like citizens, have the right under the constitution to advocate on all issues. The question is, if the funding strays outside matters for which you're licensed, you may find yourself in hot water. If the funding goes to entities that are not, such as yourself, civil society organizations, so you're now directly funding partisan political organizations, you may find yourself in hot water. There's also been a mischaracterization, in my view, of civic advocacy. So you're advocating, say, for civic education, or you're helping voter education, you're helping people understand how to go about exercising their rights in elections. That should be neutral to everybody, but sometimes is perceived by those who perhaps prefer voters to be less aware of things as political funding. It needs to be carefully done in order that you don't stray across the line. You'll also find that many times from the donor agencies that you have, that they too, in their own regulatory systems, cannot or should not be going into direct partisan political situations. So it's important, it's a fine line, but you need to be aware of it. Angela Nalunga asked a connected question about the difference between political advocacy and direct lobbying. Advocacy is the wider raising of awareness around issues. Lobbying is the more direct involvement with individuals, say legislators, public officials, on specific issues. Whilst lobbying is a form of advocacy, not all advocacy is lobbying. So some lobbying might just be putting word out there, setting up programs of education, just generally making people more knowledgeable and more active, or seeking to make them more active in particular spaces, and also raising awareness of the condition of certain people. Lobbying will be looking for your legislator, writing to him, writing to the president, engaging with particular individuals or officials on specific things. Some lobbying will be partisanly political and therefore be outside the scope of CSOs. But as I said, all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. You need to know what you're permitted to do by your license constitution and what you're not. How do CSOs best navigate? This is Violet asking, Violet Linda. How do CSOs best navigate the thin line between advocacy and political advocacy? I think that's similar to the lobbying advocacy question. If I sound tautologous or I sound like I'm promoting legal advice, maybe I am. It's important that you understand where that thin line is, and where the thin line is varies from situation to situation and from organization to organization, based on your constitution, based on your license, based on circumstances. So it may be that the thin line is not so thin when it comes to, say, access to water. It may be that the line is very thin when it comes to electoral advocacy and understanding of how citizens participate in elections. You need to be taking very great care and taking external advice and internal advice constantly. I think those were largely the questions that I could address. I think the last one was Eric Abima asking that in his experience with the FIA, the process is long and can sometimes be intimidating. Is someone allowed to go with a lawyer during an FIA interview sessions? The answer, Eric, is yes, you are entitled to a lawyer during these processes. It's a constitutional right that when you're going through administrative processes, you're treated fairly. Fair treatment includes knowing your rights and being able to advise yourself properly. So whereas that process is not a trial, it's a process in which you are entitled certainly to legal advice, and one should be able to access. Alan Moheres asked a question and didn't then elaborate on it. I'll wait for him to do so. Eunice or Ronald. Eunice, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, David. That has clarified most of the questions and also spoken a bit to some of the aspects that Nicholas Opiyo would have covered in his session. I see that Ronald has so many questions regarding tax issues, so I'll hand over to Ronald to address those specifically. I hope you've been able to see the numerous questions in the chat group.
Yes, thank you, Eunice. I've tried to answer some of them. I'll just tackle a few that are not yet answered. James is asking if you are designated by URA as an agent and you have actually not been withholding, but somehow the suppliers get to file their taxes. So should the URA come to recover the tax from you? Ideally, withholding tax is an advance tax paid by the other person, the supplier. So the question, as I understand it, is if, for example, you made the payment this year to the supplier and you did not withhold the 6% and you're an agent, but the supplier went ahead to declare that full income, the payment you gave them to the URA in full when they were filing their returns at the end of the year. So this is not something that is provided for within the law, what happens in that instance. But my take would be that if your supplier cooperates and shows that they paid their tax in full, perhaps then URA will just demand the interest or a penalty on you for failure to withhold in the first place. But the principal tax would have been paid to them, because even if you did withhold the tax from them, they would have to use it as a credit. Remember, I've said that withholding tax is an advance tax, or a credit that you pay in advance. So you talk to the supplier and see whether you can approach this issue together with them before the URA. The other question is about expatriates and NSSF contributions. We've had a long-running dispute with the NSSF, at least myself professionally. This issue has repeatedly come up. Under the NSSF Act, a non-resident person is one who is to stay in Uganda for a period of less than 3 years. Section 13 of that Act requires that if you are not an eligible employee, for example, like a non-resident, you pay 10% special contribution to the NSSF, but that 10% is not recoverable. Essentially, it goes to the reserve fund. The expatriate does not get it. Essentially, it's like a tax on the organization for employing the non-resident expatriate. And the question has been, normally, the NSSF position is that once you employ somebody who is non-resident, then you must pay that 10% as an organization. There has been discussions on to whether a non-resident is eligible, or the minister must first designate you under the rules of that section for the non-resident to pay that 10%. But NSSF's position is that if the person is a non-resident, the 10% is due and it's not recoverable. So what other organizations do is that they pay the 15% so that the expatriate also contributes 5%. And then at the end of the 3rd year, or at whatever time the expatriate is leaving, whichever is earlier, they can get back the 15% instead of donating the 10% to the reserve fund, essentially. But this is not a settled position in terms of what contributions are due from non-residents. Please throw more light on the waiver of June 2020. So just last month, the URA, the president signed into law the Tax Procedure Code Amendment Act of 2020. And in that act, the provision says that all interest and penalty that is due by 30th of June 2020 is waived. It's as simple as that. So if you had tax liabilities that fell due prior to June 2020, and those liabilities attracted interest and penalty, then that interest is waived. So it is as simple as that. This waiver does not apply to interest that has accrued from June 2020 up to now. So essentially, the law has reset the time of counting the interest and penalty from whenever you are supposed to account for that tax to June 2020. So now you start counting the interest and penalty from 1st June 2020. I hope that is clear. Alan is asking, is there a legal obligation for not-for-profit organizations that are limited by guarantee to also register as NGOs. Yes, so since this law came into force, the 2016 new law came into force, before you go to the bureau to ask for a permit or a certificate of registration, you must have a certificate of incorporation from the company's registry. So they expect that before you go to register with them, you are already a corporate person registered under the Companies Act. The position was slightly different before, in that you could just go to the bureau, and once you register with them, then you get automatic legal personality. That has changed. So currently the position is, as an NGO, you first go and register under the Companies Act, possibly as a company limited by guarantee, and then you go to the NGO bureau and get both the permit and the certificate of registration with them. So those are 3 key documents which you must have at the end of the process. If I pay suppliers who have no TIN numbers and withhold tax and remit, do I have any liability for working with non-registered suppliers? So there is a drive by the URA to get as many people to register and have TINs as possible, essentially to expand the tax base. So the risk you face here, the risk here with dealing with non-registered people is essentially for income tax. That any supplier you pay more than 5 million, but any person who supplies you more than 5 million and they are not registered for tax, so they don't have a TIN, that expense is not allowable for tax purposes. But if you're an NGO and you are exempt from income tax, at the end of the day, it wouldn't matter because this wouldn't be a business expense. But essentially, the bottom line is you encourage your suppliers to register and have TINs. Is it necessary for NGOs to pay withholding tax if you use hotel services for a meeting, yet the hotels pay more taxes? Or is it only for professional services? So, you know, we have a common saying that as tax people, that there is no equity in tax. So normally, if you see that the law is imposing a tax on you, it is not a good argument to say, but why is my neighbor, the law is imposing less tax on my neighbor? Why? So if you are designated as an agent, the requirement is to pay on all, to withhold on all payments exceeding 1 million for any good or for any service. So even if you're paying a hotel, you went and used their facilities and they gave you a bill for 2 million, you must withhold unless if those people are exempted from taxes. Then you pay them the full amount. Otherwise, if URA comes up for review later, you'll be the one on the hook for that tax. Then as NGOs, especially those fighting for tax justice, isn't pointing guns to NGOs similar to running after chicken thieves. I think Sophie is complaining about URA trying to designate as many NGOs as withholding tax agents as possible. I wish we had the URA person here to answer for us, but essentially to the fact that they compulsorily co-opt you to withhold on all payments that you make. Since this is not something that is specifically geared to NGOs, but to many other people, I think it is one of the drives they are carrying out to expand the tax base, to make to get as many people as possible to pay, to contribute to the national cake, as you would call it. James, for a consultant employee who serves in more than one entity but does not disclose his engagement. So the law puts an obligation on the employee to disclose to the employer that you have more than one place of employment. But of course, we know there are some notorious ones. For example, we know some people who are lecturers at the university, but you employ them in your organization and as well. They are very ubiquitous, so say famous. So you should look out for those ones. Don't wait for the dispute to come from the URA. But essentially, the law requires the employee rather, to disclose to the employer that they have a secondary place of employment so that the correct taxes can be computed. There's another question on if you apply for a tax exemption certificate and the URA takes longer. Unfortunately, there is no time limit. This is something we have been trying to lobby for, because the law that gives, we have seen cases where they have taken 2 years to come back with an answer. You apply for exemption for 2018, they tell you in 2020 that now we have exempted you for 2019. We're already in 2020. Doesn't make sense. Unfortunately, there is no time limit set within the law, but it's something we've been lobbying for so that they go, they move faster with these approvals. At the moment, your only remedy is to lobby and follow up as vehemently as possible so that your exemption is confirmed. There's another question about input tax for CSOs. Essentially, input tax, if you're an NGO and they charge you tax, which you would call input tax, it is a cost to you. You don't claim it. You are like a final consumer of that product. For example, if you come and purchase legal services from me, I'm a registered VAT person, I will invoice you with VAT. You cannot claim that VAT, you must pay it to the URA. The law presumes that you are a final consumer. So you should account for that VAT and pay it. You pay it to me and then I pay it over to the URA as output. You have no input claim. So there's another question here. Lee is saying the URA told them now that they were designated as a withholding agent. This is something I talked about. The designation happened in 2018, but some people are getting notified now in writing. Okay? So what happens now is that the thing to do for now is you start withholding, as we talked about. You need to file your monthly withholding tax returns on all the payments you have made that qualify. But it would be good for you to look back and establish your liability and explore avenues of waiver, because the challenge we are having here is that the URA published a notice in the Gazette with people's TINs on them, but they never individually notified people to start complying. So that has been a challenge, because if you are telling me now in 2020 that you should have been withholding for 1.5 years, it becomes a problem. The NGO is not primarily a tax entity. It would have helped if they had done the notification either on the person's TIN or by letter at the time when the designation happened. Yeah, so Beth is asking, what is the implication of withholding tax exemption for CSOs? If you are exempted from tax, that means that when people are paying you, they don't withhold. But I don't ascertain that this is a common occurrence for NGOs, because they are not in business. It is very rare for a CSO to have withholding tax exemption. Should I withhold tax on medical insurance and workman's compensation? So if you're paying for any service, unless if the person you're paying is exempt, or the income you're paying for is exempt on the part of the other person, then you ought to withhold. There are things that are gray. For example, you are paying premiums, insurance premium for medical, or you're paying for what do we call them? David, what do we call ULS fees? Subscription fees. Those of you who are members of ULS, who are members of SCCA, if you're paying SCCA membership fee, or if you're paying for any membership fee for NGOs, do you withhold? People typically don't withhold because we don't take this as a payment for a good or for a service. But there's no pronouncement from the URA as at this time, but generally we do not withhold on such payments.
Okay, Ronald, I'm going to request you to finalize in 1 minute so that we can, our time is well spent. Yes,
I'm going to answer one more question. I think the rest we can answer in writing to the individual people because I see the questions are many. Do we have an obligation to disclose rental tax on behalf of the landlord? Yes. In your income tax return that you file, there's a requirement for you to disclose who your landlord is and how much you have paid to them. It doesn't mean that you are the one who is going to pay the rental tax, but your return normally is incomplete if you have not indicated who is your landlord and how much the rental expense is. So Eunice, I think I'll answer the rest of the questions and forward them to the participants after.
Okay, thank you. Does that mean that the chat room will be kept open for you to answer the questions, or you forward them?
No, we have a team that's going to compile the questions for us, and then we put in the answers, and then they are mailed back to the participants.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ronald. Thank you so much, David. I'm going to request the panelists to give us their parting thoughts, to give us their takeaways from this webinar. Clearly, it was well needed. It was quite responsive to the sector. A lot of tax issues have come up. Ernest & Young used to do for us a training on tax compliance. Maybe that's something as well Bowmans can take up. As I can see, my colleagues from the sector have so many questions to ask. Thank you so much, the CSO sector, the NGOs that have turned up for this webinar. Some of you came in late, but the webinar has been recorded and it's going to be sent to all of us to be able to replay it. And the presentations as well will be sent to us in the follow-up email to enable us catch up with the tax issues. This has really been quite educative. Thank you so much to Bowmans and Chapter 4 for organizing this session. So I'll request David to go first with his parting thoughts.
Thank you very much, Eunice, and thank you very much, participants, for sparing this time to listen to what we had to share. My parting thoughts would be really a repetition of the things that we come out saying, that one, we need to be conscious of the environment that we work in, we operate in, and be mindful of the fact that in it are a number of lines, if you like to think of them that way, that we need to be either aware of and stay on the right side of, or be mindful when we're crossing them and know that we've taken a risk, a calculated risk, and understand with the understanding that there might be consequences. But also to be aware that formality over informality gives us an opportunity, a better opportunity to survive in the environment, and an understanding that in the situation of distress there are remedies. There are situations where it seems like the world is closing in on an organization, but there are remedies, and those remedies are enhanced if we have been working right from the get-go formally with an understanding of legal risk. Perhaps one small point which I hadn't raised that I'd hoped Nicholas would talk about, we discussed at this point in relation to Nicholas's own presentation, is that sometimes organizations get infected, I use that word wisely, with the views of their donors, and sometimes look at our legal regime as being entirely obstructed or entirely made up of red tape. This also happens in the corporate commercial world. So don't just think that it's a matter for CSOs only. But sometimes the parents' attitude to local regulation and local legislation is that it's all obstruction, it's all red tape, just get it out of the way, it's nonsense. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Not all our regulations are completely about red tape. There might be a bit of rule by law, but we can't have rule of law which we aspire to if we don't have law. So on our side, we always try to advise players to ensure that there's full compliance, maximum compliance, that there is an understanding of the legal regime that one needs to comply with, and therefore occupation of the legal and common sense positions in order that whatever attack comes on you will have to be extra legal. That is easier to fight than if you're acting arbitrarily. So kindly take those to heart. Those are my contributions today, and I thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you, David, for those parting thoughts. Over to you, Ronald.
Thank you, Eunice. For my part, I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us for this webinar and for the active participation that you have taken in terms of taking interest in the tax and compliance issues of your organization. I would say that from a tax point of view, as a practitioner, the parting, if you are to go away with one thing from this webinar, is you be proactive. Don't wait for the URA to come to your door, and compliance is cheaper if you are the one in control of it than if it is the government that is in control of your compliance. So it's important to take issues personally and to pay attention to them. I see you guys have a lot of questions, the nitty-gritties. That means that you are tax conscious, and of course we are here to help you. After this webinar, we have a fully fledged tax department here, and we'll be able to attend to all your tax needs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ronald. Thank you, our panelists. Thank you, our participants, for joining us this morning and for time well spent. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.